The path down from Elias's mountain cabin was no longer the familiar trail he had walked in his youth. It had become a treacherous ribbon of mud, jagged rocks, and black ice winding through the skeletal remains of ancient pine trees. The storm, which had once screamed with a violent fury, had now settled into a heavy, suffocating fog, a thick, gray veil that seemed to swallow the very light from Clara's lantern before it could travel more than a few inches. Elias felt the damp cold seeping into his joints, a reminder of the 30 years he had spent in isolation. Every step was a heavy journey through time itself. The trees, their branches laden with frost, seemed to lean in toward them, whispering silent judgments as they passed. They didn't speak. The weight of the iron key in Elias's pocket and the gravity of their mission was a third companion, walking silently between them in the freezing mist. As they reached the outskirts of the village, Whispering Pines looked less like a living community and more like a graveyard of forgotten memories. The houses, once filled with the warmth of hearths and the laughter of families Elias knew by name, were now dark, their shuttered windows resembling empty eye sockets staring blankly into the fog. This was the place Elias had called home, where he had once spent his days carving intricate cradles for newborns and sturdy oak tables for his neighbors. Now he felt like a ghost haunting his own life, walking through a world that had collectively decided to cherish the lie of his guilt while forgetting the reality of his kindness. Clara moved through the shadows with the practiced stealth of a woman who had spent years navigating the secrets of the town's archives, knowing exactly which stone path would remain silent and which alleyway would hide them from the prying eyes of the midnight watch. In the very heart of the village square stood the great Clocktower, a jagged monolith of weathered stone and rusted iron that loomed over the town like a frozen, forgotten god. It had not struck a single hour since the night of the Great Fire. Its massive brass hands remained locked in a permanent, silent V, as if the tower itself had surrendered to the deception built beneath its foundations. To the current generation of villagers, the tower was merely a ruin to be avoided, a grim monument to the arsonist's destruction. But as Elias looked up, he saw the stone gargoyles perched high on the battlements, their faces worn smooth by 30 years of rain and resentment. They felt like guardians of the truth he had been denied. He reached into his coat and felt the rusted iron key. It seemed to hum against his palm, a cold piece of metal finally demanding to be returned to its rightful place. They approached a small, inconspicuous side door at the base of the tower's western wall, almost entirely concealed by a thick, tangled curtain of overgrown ivy and dead vines. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the foliage away to reveal a lock that was nearly consumed by rust and the slow crawl of time. Elias stepped forward, his breath hitching in his chest as the scent of wet stone and old iron filled his lungs. His hands, the steady, calloused hands of a master craftsman, moved by ancient instinct. He slid the heavy key into the keyhole. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, the mechanism resisted, the metal grinding against 30 years of grit and neglect, with a sound that felt like a scream in the stillness of the night. Then, with a sudden, sharp thud that vibrated up Elias's arm, the tumblers clicked. The door groaned open, exhaling a stale breath of air that smelled of ancient grease, ozone, and the dry, sweet rot of forgotten paper. Stepping inside was like stepping out of time itself. The fog of the outside world did not follow them here. Instead, they were met by a darkness so profound it felt like a physical weight against their skin. Clara raised her lantern, and its amber glow flickered across a narrow spiral stone staircase that wound down into the very earth, far beneath the tower's massive foundations. The steps were thin and precarious, coated in a layer of gray dust that hadn't been disturbed since the night the world turned against Elias. As they began their descent, the air grew uncomfortably warmer, carrying the faint metallic tang of the colossal clockwork gears that sat dormant high above them. Elias could feel the pressure building in his ears, a physical reminder that they were descending into the belly of the town's darkest secrets, a place where the sun had not touched the stone for 3 decades. At the bottom of the spiral, they emerged into a chamber that felt more like a tomb than an administrative vault. Massive iron columns, thick as ancient oaks, rose from the damp floor to support the staggering weight of the clock tower above. The walls were lined with heavy, iron-bound chests and stacks of leather-bound ledgers that had turned a ghostly gray under decades of dust. This was the Vault of Lost Memories, the place where the mayor had publicly claimed all the town's historical records were destroyed in the fire. Clara moved toward a specific shelf, her eyes scanning the faded, handwritten labels with a feverish intensity that bordered on desperation. "He told the people the fire reached down here," she whispered, her voice echoing hollowly off the damp stone walls. "But look at the dust, Elias. There isn't a single mark of soot. He didn't lose these records. He buried them so they would never speak." Clara reached for a particularly heavy ledger bound in cracked black leather, the record of debts from the year of the Great Frost. She carried it to a central stone pedestal, and Elias held the lantern steady, his hand surprisingly firm despite the cold. As she turned the pages, the paper sounded like dry autumn leaves breaking underfoot. They saw names they knew, families that still occupied the front pews of the church, families that had been the first to cast stones at Elias's windows 30 years ago. Beside each name was a red-inked number, a debt so astronomical it would have taken 3 generations to repay. "The entire town was bankrupt," Clara murmured, her finger trembling as it traced the columns of red ink. "The mayor, the council, the local merchants, they were all drowning, and the only way to erase the debt was the insurance payout from the destruction of the old mill." As they reached the final pages of the ledger, they found a document that made Elias's blood run cold. Tucked loosely between the entries was a folded piece of parchment, sealed with the mayor's private signet, the very same emblem Elias had seen in the old photograph back at the cabin. It wasn't an insurance claim. It was a private contract dated 2 days before the mill fire. The mayor had leveraged the mill's expected accidental destruction value to clear the personal debts of the town council. Elias felt a wave of crushing nausea. His life hadn't been ruined by a tragic accident or a neighbor's momentary lapse in judgment. It had been calculated, signed, and sealed. He was the commodity that had made the town's bankruptcy vanish. In the margin, written in the mayor's elegant, icy handwriting, were the words, "The scapegoat, finalized." Beneath the ledger, Elias discovered a small hammered metal box tucked away in a corner of the pedestal. It wasn't locked. It was held shut by a simple brass latch. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the village's old sewer and mining tunnel system, dating back to the town's founding. One specific line had been traced over and over in thick black charcoal, creating a dark artery that connected the mayor's private residence directly to the basement of the old mill. Elias stared at the map, the pieces of the 30-year puzzle finally snapping into a horrifying picture. "The tunnels," he whispered, his voice thick with realization. He didn't have to walk through the square that night. He used the old mining shafts to move unseen. That's how he planted the oil. That's how he set the fire and returned to his bed before the first alarm even rang. Just as Elias reached out to take the map, a sound shattered the heavy silence of the vault, a sharp metallic clink, followed by the unmistakable rhythmic thud of heavy leather boots on the stone stairs far above. Elias and Clara froze instantly, the amber light of the lantern dancing wildly against the walls as Clara's breath became shallow and panicked. Someone was coming, someone who still possessed a key to the tower after all these years, someone who clearly did not want the ghosts of Whispering Pines to be disturbed. "The mayor's night watch," Clara hissed, her voice a terrified, barely audible whisper. "They check the lower foundations every hour during a storm to ensure the tower hasn't shifted. If they find us here with these books, we will never leave this vault alive." Thinking quickly, Elias grabbed the black ledger and the charcoal map, shoving them into Clara's leather satchel with desperate speed. He signaled to her, and they doused the lantern just as a bright beam of white light from a modern flashlight hit the top of the spiral staircase. The darkness that rushed in was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. Elias pulled Clara into the narrow shadows behind one of the massive iron columns, his hand pressed firmly over her mouth to stifle her gasping breaths. They huddled together as the guard descended, the jingle of a heavy keychain, and the slow, deliberate thud of boots growing louder and louder. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, illuminating the dust motes and passing within inches of their feet. For a moment, the world stopped turning. Elias could feel the cold dampness of the stone against his back and the burning heat of the stolen truth in the satchel. The guard grunted, seemingly satisfied by the stillness, and began the long climb back up to the surface. They waited in the crushing darkness for what felt like hours, not daring to move until the last echo of the tower's heavy outer door had faded away. When they finally emerged from the side entrance into the gray pre-dawn mist, the world felt fundamentally different to Elias. The heavy fog was finally lifting, revealing the first pale, bruised light of morning over the jagged silhouettes of the pines. Elias looked down at the village below, his fear having been replaced by a cold, sharpened clarity he hadn't felt in 30 years. He was no longer a ghost or a victim of fate. He was a man with the power to tear down the lie that had built the town. "The festival begins tonight," Elias said, his voice as steady and unyielding as the mountain. "The mayor will be on his podium celebrating 30 years of prosperity. We are going to give this town a reckoning they will never forget. The vault has finally surrendered its secrets, but the truth is a heavy burden to carry. For 30 years, Elias lived as a ghost in the shadows of a lie. Now, with the mayor's ledger in his hands, the ghosts of Whispering Pines are beginning to wake up. The question, can justice truly exist after 30 years of silence? Or is what Elias seeks something darker than justice? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Join us next time for Chapter 4, The Festival of Ash, where the truth finally catches fire. Don't forget to subscribe and stay in the light.